What if a Ukrainian jet could outrun a missile, outrun an air defense network, and still destroy a fortress?
At 9:56 a.m., the calm over eastern Zaporizhzhia shattered in an instant. A Ukrainian MiG-29 climbing through 1,020 feet toward the Orikhiv sector was suddenly illuminated by a pulse of radar energy so sharp it felt like a punch behind the eyes. Before the pilot could process it, a 48N6DM missile had already left its tube from an S-400 battery near the outskirts of Melitopol. Racing across 118 kilometers of sky, its motor pushing it past Mach 2.3 in the first 1.4 seconds of flight. The missile's smoke trail curled upward like a white spear. The pilot didn't wait for the steady warning tone to finish. He snapped the MiG into a hard right brake, rolling the aircraft to a 92-degree aspect angle relative to the radar beam while dumping pulses of chaff every 0.45 seconds. Thousands of aluminum fibers burst open behind him, drifting like metallic snow and multiplying the radar return until one aircraft looked like a scattered swarm. But the S-400's algorithms were clever. Track quality dropped from solid to intermittent, then disappeared entirely. Deprived of updated guidance, the 48N6DM switched to inertial mode and curved toward the last predicted intercept point, detonating in a bloom of white light at 740 meters altitude, just 1.8 kilometers off the MiG's left wing. The shockwave rippled across the canopy, rattling the frame. The pilot steadied his breathing. He knew this was only the beginning. If one missile had already come this close, the next would arrive with even sharper precision. If you were in his seat, what would you do after surviving a strike like that? At 10:03 a.m., the MiG-29 skimmed low over the broken fields at 480 feet, its engine still humming from the violent maneuver that had saved it minutes earlier. The pilot believed he had slipped beneath the radar horizon, just long enough to catch his breath and rebuild a margin of safety. But the air defense network watching him was far from blind. What the pilot could not see was a second S-400 receiver positioned 41 kilometers from the main transmitter, operating in bistatic mode. Instead of staring from one angle, the system now watched him from two. The radar pulse that hit the MiG returned not to where it came from, but sideways. Weak, distorted, only -17 decibels above the noise floor. But it was enough. The return painted a faint speck on a Buck M3 fire control screen perched on a ridge overlooking the valley. The crew had been waiting for this. They had coordinates precise to within 35 meters, speed 472 knots, altitude 487 feet, heading 069. The moment the MiG entered the valley's throat, the Book's 9S-36M radar snapped from standby to full power in 2.7 seconds, locking instantly. Two 9M317MA missiles erupted upward, their motors producing a shock column so bright it left temporary burns on the operator's retinas. Acceleration peaked at 31 G, pushing the missiles past Mach 3.1 before they cleared the tree line. In the cockpit, the pilot's threat receiver exploded with alarms. Another ambush perfectly timed. He pitched the MiG upward in a steep climbing roll, forcing altitude for just a second before dumping the nose and pulling -G to break the intercept geometry. The missiles tore past at less than 140 meters their proximity fuses, triggering harmless bursts of air. He'd survived again, but barely, and his evasive climb had pushed him toward higher altitude. At 10:14 a.m., the MiG-29 clawed upward through thinning air, its engine straining as the altimeter unwound past 13,800 feet and toward the height required for release. The pilot didn't want the climb. Every meter exposed him to more sensors. But he had no choice. The only way to give his weapons range was altitude. Below him, the Book M3 crew completed what should have been the finishing blow. Their reload cycle, drilled hundreds of times, took 47 seconds, and the launcher rose again with clinical precision. This time, they fired two more 9M317MA missiles. But in their urgency, they made a subtle tactical mistake. Both were launched simultaneously instead of staggered. Two threats arriving at the same second created one defensive window, not two. The MiG reached 14,260 feet, speed holding at 302 knots, barely enough for his targeting computer to align. Fire control cues stabilized, wind drift calculated, GPS handshake complete in 15 seconds. The pilot armed his payload, 2 GBU-39B small-diameter bombs, each with a precise glide profile exceeding 100 kilometers in optimal release. At the final cue, he pickled both. The weapons dropped cleanly, wings snapping open like metallic feathers. As gravity took them, the pilot inverted and dove away from the incoming missiles, pulling 6.9 G through his chest. The missiles overshot in wide arcs, unable to match the sudden reversal. 6 minutes later, the first GBU-39B slammed into the battalion command post, its 18-kilogram fused explosive collapsing the structure inward. The second penetrated 2.8 feet of reinforced concrete before reaching the ammunition stockpile, an overloaded cache of 475 tons. The resulting detonation turned the bunker into a rising column of dust and fire that marked the mission's turning point. By 10:32 a.m., the MiG-29 was already descending from its escape dive, fuel running dangerously low at 1,780 kilograms and airspeed holding at a fragile 268 knots. The pilot hoped the chaos behind him would buy time, but the integrated air defense network was faster than he expected. A new signal appeared on his threat receiver, broad, powerful, unmistakable. A Su-35S, vectored by the same S-400 and book network he had just escaped, was closing from 89 kilometers away. The Russian fighter accelerated past 515 knots, climbing to 20,400 feet for the perfect angle. Its Urbis-E radar detected the MiG instantly. A lone aircraft with diminishing speed was the easiest target to classify. At 56 kilometers, the Su-35 achieved a stable track and prepared its primary weapon, an R-77-1 active radar missile with a nominal reach of 110 kilometers. The missile dropped cleanly from its pylon and lit a moment later, accelerating past Mach 4.2 in 3 seconds. The MiG's warning receiver erupted. Time to impact: 48 seconds. The Ukrainian pilot pulled the nose up, far beyond what his engines wanted, climbing through 32 degrees, then 47 degrees, then 61 degrees as his airspeed drained away like water through a pinhole. At 176 knots, the aircraft was barely flying. At 71 degrees nose up, the MiG stalled deliberately, pivoting around its own weight as if the air had suddenly thickened around it. The R-77-1 overshot by more than 320 meters, its guidance unable to reconcile a target that had nearly zero forward velocity. But the escape cost him everything. The MiG fell through the air, tumbling toward 5,200 feet, bleeding energy and altitude, and the Su-35 wasn't done. Its next attack would not rely on radar at all. The MiG-29 steadied at 5,200 feet, engines straining from the violent stall recovery. Airspeed crept back to 214 knots, just enough to halt the descent, but the aircraft was now deep inside the engagement envelope of short-range defenses, exactly where the integrated Russian network wanted him. The Su-35, having overshot its missile run, climbed sharply to 19,800 feet and repositioned for a diving attack. The Ukrainian pilot could see the fighter's silhouette glinting in the sun, a dark shape circling like a predator marking its prey. But before the Russian jet could re-engage, the MiG crossed a line on the map the pilot didn't even know existed. Below, tucked beneath a thin tree line along a shallow riverbed, a ZSU-23-4 Shilka had been waiting. The vehicle was positioned deliberately at a point where any low-flying aircraft escaping toward Ukrainian lines would have to pass. The ambush geometry was perfect. At 10:14 a.m., the Shilka's radar acquired the MiG at 2.4 kilometers, altitude 62 feet, closure rate 297 knots. The gunner's fire control computer calculated a lead angle within 0.12 seconds, and 4 23mm cannons opened fire with a combined rate exceeding 3,400 rounds per minute. The air exploded into razor-thin tracer streaks. The pilot didn't think, There was no time to. He rolled the MiG inverted, pulling negative 0.9 G, dropping the cockpit to within 5 to 7 meters of the ground. The tracers tore overhead, close enough for the shockwave of each passing round to thump through the canopy. A burst of impacts hammered the fuselage. 3 shells punched through the vertical stabilizer, 2 clipped the right wing near the flap root, 1 severed hydraulic lines feeding the ailerons. Warning lights erupted across the panel. Hydraulic pressure plummeted from 2,600 psi to under 900 in seconds. The flight control system reverted to manual mode, the stick suddenly feeling as if it were connected through concrete and rusted cables. The Shilka gunner adjusted, trying to drag the line of fire downward, but the inverted MiG hugged the terrain too closely. The radar momentarily locked onto ground clutter, hesitating just long enough for the Ukrainian fighter to slip out of the engagement zone. Trailing hydraulic mist and smoke, the MiG roared eastward at treetop height. Only 88 kilograms of fuel remained, and the engine temperature was rising toward limits no pilot ever wanted to see. But he had one final barrier left before home: re-entry toward Ukrainian airspace, and a landing attempt that would push the crippled aircraft to its absolute edge. At 10:17 hours, the MiG-29 crossed the invisible line marking Ukrainian-controlled airspace. But the aircraft was no longer a fighter, just a wounded frame carried forward by momentum and luck. Fuel had fallen to 42 kilograms, barely enough for a few minutes of level flight. Hydraulic pressure hovered near 780 pounds per square inch, well below safe thresholds. And the engine temperature gauge had crept past its red arc by 12%, warning of impending failure. Ahead, through the haze of heat and smoke drifting off the damaged wings, the pilot finally spotted the improvised forward airstrip, 3.1 kilometers away. A narrow strip of concrete hastily repaired the night before, its surface still marred by patched craters and loose gravel. There was no time for a landing pattern, no altitude for a go-around. He dropped the gear using the emergency pneumatic system. The left and right mains locked with 2 hard metallic clunks. The nose gear hesitated, then snapped into place after 1.4 seconds of nerve-shredding silence. Descending at 176 knots, the MiG struck the runway harder than intended. The main wheels bounced once, nearly a meter off the surface, before settling again. The nose refused to drop at first. With no remaining hydraulic authority, the pilot forced the stick forward manually until gravity overcame the damaged controls. The nose gear finally lowered and locked on the second attempt, just moments before the aircraft's forward section would have scraped the pavement. The engines flamed out 9 seconds after touchdown, turbines groaning as metal shrieked against metal. Momentum carried the MiG another 61 meters, rolling to a stop just short of a maintenance shelter, leaking fuel, oil, and hydraulic mist. The jet was riddled with holes, scorched, and silent. But it was home. When the MiG-29 finally rolled to a stop, hissing steam and leaking fluid onto the cracked pavement, the battlefield fell silent around it. The aircraft that had just slipped past hypersonic missiles, radar traps, a hunting Su-35, and a wall of ground fire now looked more like a wounded survivor than a machine built for speed. Yet despite the torn metal and scorched paint, the mission's outcome was unmistakable. The command post was gone. The ammunition fortress, hundreds of tons of shells and rockets, had collapsed into a churning crater of smoke and shattered concrete. And the air defense network that had tried to stop one aircraft failed at every tier. For the pilot, survival wasn't a guarantee. It was a calculation measured in seconds, altitude, and instinct. For Ukraine, the strike was more than a tactical victory. It was proof that precision, planning, and courage could break through even the most layered defenses. And for anyone watching, it raises a simple question. What mattered more, his aircraft's systems or the decisions he made in the tightest moments of his life? Tell me in the comments, which part of this mission stunned you the most?